The first Apple computer that I ever used was the Apple IIe. Now this would have been around about 1987, 1988, and we had these in my middle school. So my tech nomination for 1987 is the Apple IIe, which was released in 1983. Now, 1987 was the year that I turned 14, and I was probably listening to In Excess and Talking Heads at the time. But as far as computers went, my friends and I at the time were playing games like Montezuma's Revenge and Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego on the Apple IIes at school. Now, I don't have an Apple IIe with me here in the studio today, but I do have a mini 3D printed version. As you can see, it's got the main keyboard and the floppy drive and the monochrome green on black screen. Now, we didn't have color monitors at our school with the Apple IIes. Instead, we had the classic green on black monitor with no colors instead. And another one of my favorite games on the Apple IIe at the time, which shows this green on black screen perfectly, was the game Taipan, which you can see here on this emulator. By the way, if you're interested, this game is available at taipangame.com, and you can play the full amazing game online. The Taipan trading game was also once known as Steve Wozniak's favorite computer game of all time. So to put the lack of colors and the green on black monitors into context, this was at a time when only 3-4 years ago on my VIC-20 and Commodore 64, I was playing games that displayed all sorts of different colors. And here I was back in the monochrome world. At the age of 14, the Apple IIe was already the 6th computer that I'd ever used, 3 of which I had used extensively. And this was the difference between having a computer that hooked up to your TV versus a serious computer that hooked up to its own monitor. These were not the same things as TVs, of course. It did feel like a step backwards. Yet using the Apple IIes, perhaps in the school environment, did feel a lot more grown up and a lot more serious in terms of computing. And of course, all my life I grew up thinking that the E in Apple IIe stood for education, that these were education computers, but apparently it stood for expanded or extended. Another big difference with the Apple was that instead of using cassette tapes like I'd always used, they now use these floppy disks that went into the disk drives, from which you could load your games and save your code. What it really meant was that we could now take these floppy disks, give them to our friends, and copy over one game to another and share with friends all the best games. And using the Apple IIe meant, just like previous generations of computers, using the keyboard for commands. Using these computers also meant that everything had to be typed in via the keyboard. There was no clicking, no touch screens, not even a mouse. Everything had to be typed in with the keyboard, even the games. But it wasn't all just games on the Apple IIe. Of course, we couldn't necessarily do our homework on these things, but what we could do is extend our knowledge of programming, often things like basic programming from our earlier Commodore days. You needed to type in commands for anything such as a reset, load game, or even to operate one of your floppy drives. Everything was done manually. In the end, Apple sold something like 2 million of these Apple II computers, and the range lasted for over a decade. By the following year, 1988, my school got one of these Mac Plus computers, and it came with something called a mouse. And instead of using these big old disks, they now use these smaller disks, as well as having something called a graphical user interface, which allowed me to do things like graphic design and early desktop publishing. But all of that is for another episode. It's safe to say that I had a strong affinity for the Apple IIe computer back then, and I'm still an Apple/Mac user today, nearly 40 years later. So my tech nomination for 1987 is the Apple IIe computer. Don't forget to subscribe to help me out with the channel, and see you on the next episode. Thanks for watching.